Chapter 10. Mayhem at the Ministry. Mr. Weasley woke them after only a few hours sleep, used magic to pack up the tent, and they left the campsite as quickly as possible. Passing his cottage, Mr. Robert had a strange Mr. Roberts at the door of dazed look about him, and we waved them off with a vague Merry Christmas. "We'll be all right," said Mr. Weasley quietly as they marched off onto the moor. Sometimes when a person's memory is modified, it makes him a bit disoriented for a while. And that was a big thing they had to make him forget. They heard urgent voices as they approached the spot where the port key lay, and when they reached it, they found a great number of witches and wizards gathered around Basil, the keeper of the port tree, all clamoring to get away from the campsite as quickly as possible. Mr. Weasley had a hurried discussion with Basil. They joined the queue and were able to take an old rubber tire back to Stott's Head. Well before the sun had really risen, they walked back through Audrey Street, Catchpole, and up the dam lane toward the burrow in the downlight, talking very little because they were so exhausted and thinking longingly of their breakfast as they rounded the corner and the burrow came into view. A cry echoed along the lane. "Oh, thank goddess!" Mr. Weasley, who had evidently been waiting for them in the front yard, came running toward them, still wearing her bedroom slipper, her face pale and strained, a rolled up copy of the Daily Prophet clutched in her hand. "Arthur, I have been so worried, so worried." She flung her arm around Mr. Weasley's neck. The Daily Prophet fell out of her limp hand onto the ground. Looking down, Harry saw the headline, "Scenes of the Terror at the Quidditch World Cup," it with twinkling black and white photograph of the dark mark over the treetops. "You're all right," Mrs. Weasley muttered distractedly, realizing Mr. Weasley and staring around at all of with red eyes. "You are alive, oh boys!" And to everybody's surprise, she seized Fred and George and pulled them both into such tight hug that their heads banged together. "Ouch! Mum, you're strangling us!" "I shouted at you before you left," Mrs. Weasley said, starting to sob. "It's all I have been thinking about. What if you know who had got you? The last thing I ever said to you was that you didn't get enough owls." "Oh, Fred, George, come on now, Molly. We are all perfectly okay," said Mr. Weasley, somethingly breezing her off the twins and leading her back toward the house. "Bill," he added in an undertone, "pick up that paper. I want to see what it says." When they were all crammed into the tiny kitchen, Harmony had made Mrs. Weasley a cup of very strong tea into which Mr. Weasley insisted on pouring a shot of Odgain old fire whiskey. Bill handed his father the newspaper. Mr. Weasley scanned the front page while Percy looked over his shoulder. "I knew it," said Mr. Weasley heavily. "Ministry blunder, culprit not apprehended, lax security, dark wizard running witch raid, national disgrace. Who wrote this?" Of course, Rita Skeeter. That woman's got in for the Ministry of Magic," said Percy furiously. "Last week she was saying we're wasting our time quibbling out cordon thickness when we should be stamping out vampires, as if it wasn't specially stated in paragraph 12 of the guideline for the treatment of non-wizard part humans." "Do us a favor, Puss," said Bill, yawning, "and shut up. I mentioned Mr. Weasley." His eyes widened behind his glasses as he reached the bottom of the Daily Prophet article. "Where?" spluttered Mrs. Weasley, cooking on her tea and whiskey. "If I had seen that, I'd have known you were alive." "Not by name," said Mr. Weasley. "Listen to this. If the terrified wizard and the witches who waited breathless for news at the edge of the wood expect reassurance from the Ministry of Magic, they were sadly disappointed. The ministry official emerged sometime after the appearance of the dark mark, alleging that nobody had been hurt, refusing to give any more information. Whether this statement will be enough to squash the rumor that several bodies were removed from the wood an hour later remained to be seen. "Oh, really?" said Mr. Weasley in explanation, handing this newspaper to Percy. "Nobody was hurt. What was I supposed to say? Rumors that several bodies were removed from the wood. Well, there certainly will be rumors now." She had printed that. He heaved a deep sigh. "Molly, I'm going to have to go into the office. This is going to take some smoothing over." "I'll come with you," father said Percy importantly. "Mr. Crouch will need all hands on deck and I can give him my cauldron report in person." He bustled out of the kitchen. Mrs. Weasley looked most upset. "Arthur, you are supposed to be on holiday. This hasn't got anything to do with your office, surely. We can handle this without you." "I have got to go, Molly," said Mr. Weasley. "I have made things worse. I'll just change into my robes and I'll be off." "Mrs. Weasley," said Harry suddenly, able to contain himself. "Hedwig hasn't arrived with a letter for me, has he?" "Hedwig, dear," said Mrs. Weasley distractedly. "No, no, there hasn't been any post at all." Ron and Hermione looked curiously at Harry with a meaningful look at both of them. He said, "All right, if I go and dump my stuff in your room, Ron." "Yeah, think I will too," said Ron at once. "Hermione?" "Yes," she said quickly. The three of them marched out of the kitchen and up the stairs. "What's up, Harry?" said Ron the moment they had crossed the door of the attic room behind them. "There is something I haven't told you," Harry said. "On Saturday morning, I woke up with my scar hurting again." Ron's and Hermione's reaction were almost exactly as Harry had imagined them back in the bedroom on Private Drive. Hermione gasped and started making suggestions at once, mentioned a number of reference books, and everybody from Albus Dumbledore to Madame Pomfrey, the Hogwarts nurse. Ron simply looked dumbstruck. "He wasn't there, was he? You know who? I mean, last time your scar kept hurting, he was at Hogwarts, wasn't he?" "I'm sure he wasn't on Private Drive," said Harry, "but I was dreaming about him. Him and Peter. You know Wormtail. I can't remember all of it now, but they were plotting to kill someone." He had tittered for a moment on the verge of saying "me," but couldn't bring himself to make Hermione look any more horrified than she already did. "It was only a dream," said Ron brassingly. "Just a nightmare." "Yeah, but was it tough?" said Harry, turning to look out of the window at a brightening sky. "It's weird, isn't it? My scar hurts, and 3 days later the Death Eaters are on march, and Voldemort's signs up in the sky again." "Don't say his name," Ron hissed through gritted teeth. "And remember that Professor Trelawney said," Harry went on, ignoring Ron, "at the end of the last year. Professor Trelawney was their deviation teacher at Hogwarts." Hermione's terrified look vanished as she let out a desirable snort. "Oh, Harry, you aren't going to pay attention to anything that old fraud says." "You weren't there," said Harry. "You didn't hear her. Said time was different. I told you she went into a terrace, a real one, and she said the Dark Lord would rise again, greater and more terrible than ever before. And he had managed it because his servant was going to go back to him." And that night Wormtail escaped. There was a silence in which Ron frightened absent-mindedly, with hole in his curly cannon desperate. "Why were you asking if Hedwig had come?" Harry, Hermione asked. "Are you expecting a letter? I told Cyrus about my scar," said Harry, struggling. "I am waiting for his answer." Good thing, said Ron, his expression clearing. I bet Cyrus will know what to do. I hope he had get back to me quickly, said Harry. But we don't know where Cyrus is. He could be in Africa or somewhere, couldn't he? Said Hermione reasonably. Hedwig's not going to manage that journey in a few days. Yeah, I know, said Harry, but there was a leaden feeling in his stomach as he looked out of the window at the Hedwig free sky. Come and have a game of Quidditch in the orchard, Harry, said Ron. Come on. They're on three. Bill and Charlie and Fred and George will pay. You can try out the Ronski feint, said Ron said Hermione in an I don't think you are being a very sensitive sort of voice. Harry doesn't want to pay quits right now. He's worried and he's tired. We all need to go to bed. Yeah, I want to play Quidditch, said Harry suddenly. Hang on, I'll get my firebolt. Hermione left the room, muttering something that sounded very much like a boy. Neither Mr. Weasley nor Percy was at home much over the following week. Both left the house each morning before the rest of the family got up, and returned well after dinner every night. It's been an absolute uproar, Percy told them importantly the Sunday evening before they were due to return to Hogwarts. I have been putting out fires all week. People keep sending followers, and of course, if you don't open a follower straight away, it exploded, scorch mark all over my desk, and my best quill reduced to cinders. Why are they all sending hollers? Asked Ginny, who was mending her copy of 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi, with Spelltop on the rug in front of the living room fire, complaining about security at the World Cup. Said Percy they'll want compensation for their ruined property. Mundung's Fletchers put in a claim for a 12-bedroom tent with an in-suit jacuzzi, but I have got his number. I know for a fact he was sleeping under a clock proper on stick. Mrs. Weasley glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. Harry liked this clock. It was completely useless if you wanted to know the time, but otherwise very informative. It had 9 golden hands, and each of them was engraved with one of the Weasley's family's names. There were no numeral around the face, but description on where each family member might be. Home, school, and work were there, but there was also traveling, lost, hospital, prison, and in the position where the number 12 would be on normal clock mortar pearly. 8 of the hands were currently pointing to the home portion, but Mr. Weasley's, which was the longest, was still pointing to work. Mrs. Weasley's sign. Your father hasn't had to go into the office on weekends since the day of you know who. She said they are working him far too hard. His dinner going to be ruined if he doesn't come home soon. Well, father feel he's got to make up for his mistake at the match, doesn't he? Said Percy. If truth be told, he was a tad unwise to make a public statement without clearing it with his head of department first. Don't you dare to blame your father for what was that wrench seeker woman wrote, said Mrs. Weasley, flaring up at once. If Dad hadn't told anything, old Rita would just have said it was disgraceful that nobody from the ministry had commanded, said Bill, who was playing chess with Ron. Rita Seeker never make anyone look good. Remember, she interviewed all the Grignots, charm breakers once, and called me along here to look. Well, it is a bit long, dear, said Mrs. Weasley gently. If you had just let me know, Mum. Rain lashed against the living room window. Hermione was impressed in the standard book of Spellgrad 4, copies of which Mrs. Weasley had brought for her, Harry, and Ron in Diagon Alley. Harry was darning in a fireproof balaclava. Harry was polishing his firebolt. The broomstick serving kit Hermione had given him for his 13th birthday. Open at his feet, Fred and George were sitting in the far corner, heels out, talking in whisper, their head bent over a piece of parchment. Are you two up to? Said Mrs. Weasley sharply. Her eyes on the twins. Homework, said Fred vaguely. Don't be ridiculous, you are still on holiday, said Mrs. Weasley. Yeah, we have left a bit late, said George. You're not by any chance writing out a new order form, are you? Said Mrs. Weasley shrewdly. You wouldn't be thinking for Restart Weasley. That's Wiz by any chance. No, Mum, said Fred, looking up at her, a pained look on his face. If the Hogwarts Express crashed tomorrow and George and I died, how would you feel to know that the last thing we have ever heard from you was an unfounded accusation? Everyone laughed, even Mrs. Weasley. Oh, your father's coming, she said suddenly, looking up at the clock again. Mr. Weasley's hand had suddenly sprung from work to travelling a second later. It had shuddered to a halt on home with the other, and they heard him calling from the kitchen. Coming, Arthur, called Mrs. Weasley, hurrying out the room. A few moments later, Mr. Weasley came into the warm living room, carrying his dinner on a tray. He looked completely exhausted. Well, the fat's really in the fire now, he told Mrs. Weasley as he sat down in an armchair near the hearth and toyed unenthusiastically with his somewhat shrivelled cauliflower. Rita's stick's been flirting around all week looking for more ministry mess up to report, and now she's found out about the poor old Bertha going missing. That will be the headline in the Prophet tomorrow. I told Begman he should have sent someone to look for her ages ago. Mr. Crouch had been saying it for weeks and weeks, said Percy swiftly. Crouch is very lucky Rita hasn't found out about Winky, said Mr. Weasley irritably. There had been a week forth of headline in his house elf being caught holding the wand that conjured a dark mark. I thought we were all agreed that elf, while irresponsible, did not conjure the mark, said Percy hotly. If you make me ask me, Mr. Crouch is very lucky. No one at the Daily Prophet knows how mean he is to elves, said Hermione angrily. Now look her, Hermione, said Percy. A high-ranking ministry official like Mr. Crouch deserves unswerving obedience from his servant. His slave, you mean, said Hermione, her voice rising passionately because he didn't pay Winky, did he? I think you had all better go upstairs and check that you have packed properly, said Mrs. Weasley, taking up the argument. Come on now, all of you. Harry repacked his broomstick service kit, his firebolt over his shoulder, and went back upstairs with Ron. The rain sounded even louder at the top of the house, accompanied by loud whistling and moans from the wind, not to mention sporadic calls from the ghoul who lived in an attic. Pigwig began twinkling and zooming around his cage. When they entered, the sight of the half-packed trunk seemed to have sent him into a frenzy of excitement. Bung him some owl treat, said Ron, throwing a packet across to Harry. I'd shut him up. Harry poked a few owl treats through the bar of Pigwig's cage, then turned to his trunk. Hedwig's cage stood next to it, still empty. It's been over a week, Harry said, looking at Hedwig's deserted perch. Ron, you don't reckon Cyrus has been caught, do you? Nah, it will be in the Daily Prophet, said Ron. The ministry would want to show they had caught someone, wouldn't they? Yeah, I suppose. Look, here is the stuff Mum got for you in Tiger Alley. And she got some gold out of your vault for you. And she's washing all your socks. He heaved a pile of parcel into Harry's camp bed. and dropped the money bag and load of socks next to it. Harry started unwrapping the shopping apart from the standard book of spell grade 4 by Miranda Goshawk. He had a handful of new quills, a dozen rolls of parchment, and refill for his potion making kit. He had been running low on spine of lionfish and sense of Baldona. He was just piling underwear into his cauldron when Ron made a loud noise of disgust behind him. What is that supposed to be? He was holding up something that looked to Harry like a long maroon velvet dress. It had a moldy looking fey lace frill and a collar matching lace scarf. There was a knock on the door, and Mrs. Weasley entered, carrying an armful of freshly laundered Hogwarts robes. Here you are, she said, sorting them into two piles. Now mind you pack them properly so they don't squeeze. Mum, you have given me Ginny's new dress, said Ron, handing it out to her. Of course I haven't, said Mrs. Weasley. That's for you. Dress robe? What? Said Ron, looking horror struck. Dress robe, repeated Mrs. Weasley. It says on your school list that you are supposed to have dress robe this year. Robes for formal occasions. You have got to, kidden, said Ron in disbelief. I'm not wearing that. No way. Everyone wear them, Ron said, Mrs. Weasley crossly. They're all like that. Your father's got some for smart parties. I'll go starker before I put that on, said Ron stubbornly. Don't be so silly, said Mr. Weasley. You have got to have dress robe. They are on your list. I got some for Harry too. Show him, Harry. In some trepidation, Harry opened the last parcel on his camp bed. It wasn't as bad as he had expected. However, his dress robe didn't have any lace on them at all. In fact, they were more or less the same as his school ones, except that they were bottle green instead of black. I thought they had bring out the color of your eyes, dear, said Mrs. Weasley fondly. Well, yeah, okay, said Ron angrily, looking at Harry's robe. Why don't I have some like that? Because, well, I had to get your second hand and there wasn't a lot of choice, said Mrs. Weasley, flushing. Harry looked away. He would willingly have split all his money in his Gryffindor's for the Weasleys, but he knew they would never take it. I'm never wearing them, Ron was saying stubbornly. Never. Fine, snapped Mrs. Weasley. Go naked. And Harry made sure to get a picture of him. Goddess knows I could do with a laugh. She left the room, slamming the door behind her. There was a funny spluttering noise from behind them. Pigwidgeon was choking on an old-age owl treat. Why is everything I wore rubbish? Said Ron furiously, striding across the room to unstick Pigwidgeon's brick. That's it for today. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for next chapter. Till then, see ya. Bye bye.